Pokémon has gotten a lot of criticism in the more recent generations. Scarlet and Violet has a handful of glitches, Sword and Shield had terrible graphics, and not all Pokémon were accessible anymore. BDSP was basically a port of the original games. I can go on, but I think I've made my point pretty clear already. However, what if I told you these games are actually better than fan-favorite Generation 2 of Gold, Silver, and Crystal? What is up with it? I'm DeHong, and today I'm going to talk about why Generation 2 is actually the worst one in the series. Before I begin, I just want to clarify one thing, which is that this is just about Gold, Silver, and Crystal, which means I won't be critiquing the Gen 2 remakes Heart Gold and Soul Silver, as those are actually Generation 4 games. Anyway, first and foremost, let's talk about the Pokemon themselves. Generation 2 introduced 100 new Pokemon, some of which are actually among my favorites. However, that does not make up for the fact that a wide majority of these Pokemon just suck. Obviously, liking a Pokemon is a very subjective matter, but if you look at the stats and usability, a lot of these mons just don't cut it. Like, why do so many of these Pokemon just scream mediocrity or straight up being bad? Let me begin with the starters. Here are Typhlosion's base stats. Do they look familiar? That's because they're an exact replica of Charizard's stats. But that's just one stage. Surely, they mix it up for the pre-evolutions, right? No way they copied the stats for the entire line, right? Wrong. Listen, I am a big Cyndaquil evolutionary line enjoyer, but this is objectively lazy design and creation. If you look at the Chikorita and Totodile lines too, they almost did the exact same thing. They just switched up certain stats to try to be sneaky, such as switching the defense and special attack stats of the Bulbasaur line and making them the stats of the Chikorita line. I'm sorry, Game Freak, but you're not fooling me. Even Feraligator's name is proof of Generation 2's failures. Its name not being spelled properly due to the 10-character limit at the time is a perfect metaphor of Game Freak executing everything about Johto poorly, as there is a lot of proof that the games were rushed and not as much effort was put in as they needed. But now let's move on to the other Pokemon. Furret is so slow, Azumarill is awful, especially considering neither the Fairy type nor abilities existed yet, Sunflora is an iconic garbage Pokemon, and Unknown is arguably the most unusable Mon ever, just to name a few. You know that some of these Pokemon were straight up cheeks because they had to get new evolutions later. And thank God that happened, because some of these are also among my favorite Pokemon. But because they were not available at the time, you would have to settle for something very mid or worse than that if you wanted to use these Pokemon. There's a reason why many casual playthroughs of a Gen 2 game often just consisted of a starter, an Ampharos, which by the way isn't even available in Crystal, maybe the shiny Gyarados from Lake of Rage, and a bunch of Kanto Pokemon or Johto Pokemon that are evolutions of Kanto Pokemon, because a lot of the Johto Pokemon were just straight up not good. Some of the ones that were cool weren't even available until either the late game or in Kanto, which meant by that point it was too late to actually add them to your team. Like, hello? Can I also just point out that it's extremely ironic that Johto Pokemon cannot even be found in Johto? To add insult to injury, a lot of these Pokemon are among my favorites too, and I'm sure many others would agree with me. Even if you think you could just wait until Kanto to catch them, you have to keep in mind that many of the Pokemon there are incredibly underleveled. We'll get to that point later. But unless you want to grind them out over hours of gameplay, you're out of luck using those Pokemon. And as if that wasn't bad enough, a lot of Pokemon in Gold and Silver you couldn't even evolve during the main game because Elemental Evolutionary Stones weren't available until Kanto, so that cuts a good portion of Pokemon that you could use on your run. On the topic of Generation 2 Pokemon being bad, this is further proved by the teams of the gym leaders in Johto. Just look at these teams here. Isn't it super weird that many of these leaders have teams consisting of mostly either Generation 1 Pokemon or Generation 2 Pokemon that have evolved from Generation 1 Mons? Like, why does Faulkner have a Pidgey and a Pidgeotto when you could give him a Hoot Hoot and a Noctowl? Why does Bugsy have a Kakuna and a Metapod over an Ariados and a Ledian? And they couldn't even be bothered to at least give Morty a Misdreavus? Heck, why didn't Chuck have at least a Heracross or a Hitmontop or both? It's pretty egregious that as the 5th gym leader he only has 2 Pokemon. Would Game Freak do this if Gen 2 Mons were actually good? Probably not, I would say. Speaking of gym leaders, let's address one of the more polarizing parts about Generation 2. After you reach Ecruteak City, the game gives you an option of where to explore next, and therefore you can battle Chuck, Jasmine, and Price in any order you want. Some people will say, you can go a non-linear path in Pokemon, that's awesome. Here's my response to that, and as a disclaimer, this is a biased perspective coming from a hardcore Nuzlocker. Because there is no particular order where you must challenge these gyms, the strength of the Pokemon must be made about the same. This is especially annoying in a hardcore Nuzlocke where level caps are enforced, and making your options severely limited with this weird trio of non-ordered gyms. This also means that your Pokemon don't get the appropriate amount of experience to tackle on the Clear Split and the boss battles that come in that, particularly the Radio Tower section, forcing you to grind more. And let's face it, nobody likes to grind levels in Pokemon. This is the first example of a recurring theme in Gen 2 games. Cool concept, but poor execution. Now it's time to discuss one of the things that people love about Gen 2 games, the fact that you can explore Kanto after you conquer the Johto League. But this brings me to my next point. I think that Generation 2 depended way too much on Generation 1. What do I mean by that? Well, I already presented examples of this prior, like how a bunch of popular Gen 2 Pokemon are evolutions of Gen 1 Pokemon, and how many notable trainers in Johto use Gen 1 instead of Gen 2 Mons. But let's expand on this. Generation 2 did not introduce any fossil Pokemon, it just uses the one that Kanto has. It also uses the same villainous team in Team Rocket, and even the same Pokemon League in Indigo Plateau. Would the games actually be enjoyed by the fandom if you didn't have access to Kanto? As somebody who believes that Kanto didn't even improve on an already bad game relative to the rest of the series, I think GSC would be the worst games by far if it weren't for Kanto. On top of that, I don't even think that the way that Gen 2 handled Kanto was even good. It was basically just a gauntlet of gym battles, which does not make up for the fact that a lot of areas got closed off or changed, like the Cerulean Cave, the Safari Zone, even the Lavender Tower, which got turned into a radio tower. Kanto in this game is another example of a cool concept but poor execution. And I bet I know what some of you are thinking. You can battle Red after you collect all 16 badges in the most epic battle of epic epicness. Bet you can't say anything bad about that, but I can. Who in their right mind decided that a 23 level jump in the party aces from Blue to Red was a good idea? I'm sorry, but unless you let me hack in rare candies, I'm not interested in grinding out my Pokemon that many levels with no easy way to do it. While we're still on the topic of levels, because the game has 2 regions in it, the Elite Four and Champion levels are all super low. This makes options limited due to things like certain Pokemon not being evolved yet, and some cool and interesting moves not being accessible yet either. Of course, this is more of an issue in the hardcore Nuzlocke perspective, but either way I consider this another idea of cool concept and poor execution. But you know what is not an issue from a Nuzlocking perspective? The fact that some of the levels of the Pokemon make no sense whatsoever. Like, why are the encounters on Route 45 only leveled around the low 20s? This is at the 8th gym, mind you. But even Morty's team has a team that has the same level as these Pokemon. And as mentioned before, Pokemon in Kanto are extremely underleveled as well, with the most egregious example being Pokemon in Western Kanto being leveled like this. From face value, you would think that you were just getting started in the game, but in reality, you already have around 14 badges. This isn't a cool concept or good execution, it's just outright terrible game design. Now on to my final point, which I admit I'm willing to cut some slack with, the regional lore. Even though Lugia and the legendary beasts are among my favorite legendary Pokemon, nothing about the story was ever super memorable to me. Granted, story writing was never Pokemon's strong suit, but as with the rest of the generations, it was done very lazily and on the weaker side compared to all generations. But because stories are usually not amazing in Pokemon, I'm more okay with this. Anyway, to summarize my points so far, it can be boiled down to a few things. A lot of cool concepts in theory that were not well executed, a lot of Pokemon being forgettable and mediocre, and the fact that Johto didn't stand out as an individual region. But now, let's talk about what I do like about Johto. However, before we get into that, let's talk about something else I really like, which is when people subscribe to my channel. If you enjoyed the video so far, be sure to subscribe as it helps my channel grow and I'll continue to bring out more Pokemon content. Although I focus mostly on hardcore Nuzlockes and Pokemon trivia, I'll put out videos like this every now and then. Thank you very much, now back to the video. While certain Gen 2 Pokemon are definitely not high on my rankings, there are a few which I do like a lot. namely Umbreon, Heracross, Houndoom, Tyranitar, and Kingdra being my top 5 from the region. Some honorable mentions would include Ampharos, Skarmory, and Murkrow. In addition, I do like Lugia and the legendary beasts a lot, and Ho-Oh is pretty cool itself. I also appreciate that Gen 2 introduced held items, and some of the music is really good too, namely the Gym Leader Elite 4 theme and the Champion music. The gym types were also very novel for their time, and the introduction of breeding and baby Pokemon was pretty big too, in my opinion. So if I were to redo Generation 2, what would I have done differently? Obviously, I cannot take a time machine and go back to remake the games myself, but if I were a developer at the time, I would probably have advocated for more time to be put into the games. These games were extremely hastily released, something current day Pokemon fans are far too familiar with. I think if more time and effort were put into the Generation 2 games, all the problems I listed before would have been fixed. We are more likely to have Pokemon that are good from the start, the story would have some sustenance, and the region itself would feel more complete overall. There are some ROM hacks which do fix the problems of Johto, and I would highly recommend them if you want to play a Generation 2 game that's good. Crystal Kaizo Plus is a pure Generation 2 game that stands out, and Sacred Gold and Storm Silver are ROM hacks of Heart Gold and Soul Silver. I know they're not actually Generation 2 games, but they are Johto based, and they are, in my opinion, very good. I will be uploading videos and streaming these games at some point down the line, so be on the lookout for that. Anyway, that does it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Let me know in the comments below where Generation 2 ranks among your favorites, as well as what you liked or didn't like about it. With that, I'm out. See you guys next time.